Serious, when was a time you interacted with a seemingly normal person, but later found out that they were not? Back in the late 90s, I had a friend from work whose brother hung out with us a few times when we'd go out. He seemed normal. A few years later, he allegedly, his family maintains he's innocent, set off a couple of bombs at biotech companies as part of some extreme animal rights group he'd gotten mixed up in. He managed to evade the FBI and disappeared. It being shortly after 9/11, the FBI put him in their top 10 for a while and America's Most Wanted did a profile on him. As far as I know, he's never been caught. I've seen his picture a couple of times in movies when some cop is searching a database of suspects and it's always a weird blast from the past moment. I was in a reenactment group when I was younger, along with my family and others. Two of the dads were like the head honchos, running the show, and they did it wonderfully. We were a part of this group for years. Then come to find out that one of those head honchos had been sexually abusing his daughter since she was 7, she was 15 when it came out. He only did 3 years. I worked at Circuit City as a teenager and was helping someone looking at TVs. My boss called me over and said he needed me up front to help at checkout. Thought it was weird because there wasn't a line, but whatever. Turns out the guy I was helping was Drew Peterson, who has since been convicted of murder. This was back when he was just a suspect, but my boss recognized him from the news and didn't want to compromise my safety. Worked with a woman for 2 years at a child-related business, perfectly normal mother type with multiple children. While we worked together, she was on vacation, took her youngest child, 2-year-old, out on a hike and stabbed him in the chest with a chef's knife. She then called 911 and frantically reported they had been mugged. The police knew something was up because she also said nothing had been taken. Child miraculously survived, and it came out later that an affair she was having had been exposed the night before the stabbing. Turns out the child was a product of the affair. Talk about misplaced blame. We had a friend of the family that would always talk to us about going to his summer camp. Cool guy, the only thing was my dad did not like to send us away on summer and would rather have us work with him at his store. Turns out the guy was a pedo and would molest and take pics of the camp kids. I chatted with a random guy in the laundry room of our apartment complex. He was nice, friendly, outgoing kind of fellow. Skinny thing. A few weeks later I ran into him and his girlfriend on the elevator. I said, "Hey Mike, how's it going?" He proceeded to tell me how it was not going well for him. He'd been evicted from our apartment complex because he had like 8 people living with him, had been stabbed while he was on the bus coming home from an AA meeting, was recovering from the stab wound when his girlfriend, the one who was with him in the elevator at that very moment, broke up with him. His side piece was pregnant and the bitch in the front office wanted him to turn in his key ASAP. I was just kind of like cool. Well, see you around. Met a random elder gentleman while walking back to my car after a night out. The guy was dressed in khakis and a college sweatshirt and looked harmless. He asked for a few bucks and informed me that he was new to the area and down on his luck. Turned out that the Illinois Department of Corrections had given him a one-way bus ticket to Atlanta. He had just finished a plus 20-year sentence for murdering his ex-wife and her lover. He was trying to reconnect with his daughter who he hadn't seen since she was a little kid. Knew a kid in high school who was nice to me, and so I would hang out with him from time to time. He was always getting into trouble though, and I finally stopped hanging out with him after he brought a knife to school. Fast forward 5 years. He is now in prison for shooting a man to death over a pound of weed. Many years ago I lived in Cancun and met a very charming man who ended up dating one of my friends. We would go out in his car to go to the beach, out for dinner and whatnot. My kids would even come along once in a while. He was always in a good mood, all smiles, though later I discovered his father had been kidnapped and never found. One day he told us he was sure he was going to end up being kidnapped too, probably tortured and killed. I never understood what was going on. I moved back to my hometown and some months later I saw in the newspaper that 3 tortured bodies had been found on the side of the road from Cancun to Merida. One was my friend and I was in complete shock. When I found out who he was I could not believe it. He was a big hitman from the Zeta cartel, was involved in all sorts of criminal activity including trafficking of children. He was the bodyguard of a very known child predator and CP producer in Cancun. I cannot stop thinking how I could have been kidnapped along with this man just like the other 2 were just for being there at the wrong time. My children were in danger and I didn't even know. It is scary AF. I was flying freight to an island in the Caribbean. One day I landed and began to rush to unload the plane due to a storm being quite visible on the horizon. A man was standing next to the runway, casually watching and nothing else until I tripped and almost fell. He laughed. My response was to throw the box I was carrying at him and yelled that if he was going to just stand there like a useless lump, that I was going to put his A to work. He looked surprised and actually did begin to help unload the plane, and I left without even knowing his name. I was enlightened several days later when I came again. That man was the millionaire who owned a neighboring island that they worked on. I had thrown a box at David Copperfield. Back in like 2005-06, in my early days of music, I was on tour in the US. I was about 18-19, and at that time I was in a band that didn't make any money, so naturally we slept on floors and such after shows. We played a Midwestern city that we did really well in, had a lot of friends in the area and whatnot. Next show was only 2 hours away, so we stay with a kid from the show that was a fan. I end up going off and spending most of the night with a girl I'd end up dating, but returned back pretty late. Next day, kid decides he wants to go to the show 2 hours away. He liked smoking pot and so did I, so me and one other of our guys just rode with him to the show so we could smoke weed. Anyways, fast forward like 3 or 4 days later and we get a call from someone in that city letting us know the kid had been arrested, charged with murdering his dad and keeping him in the deep freeze of his house. The house we stayed in. The body was in there while we were there. It was crazy because he seemed like a normal dude, nothing off about him. Apparently his father was very abusive and there's a lot of nuances in the story. But either way, he still killed his dad with an axe. I went to a family gathering with my wife at the time that included a brother of hers that was rarely around. He was something of the black sheep of the family. It was my first time meeting him. He was nice, we played some volleyball in the pool, chatted, had a few beers. It was a great day. Found out the following week that he was wanted by the police at the time of the party for abducting and murdering his ex-girlfriend. He is currently in prison for the rest of his life. That was surreal as shit to discover. Was given a new employee to manage. Normal guy. Until a few weeks later I see him shoving toothpicks under his fingernails. Deeper and deeper. 5 at a time. I asked him what was up with that and he just said it makes me feel better, relaxed. Got to know him more and more. Turns out he was in and out of some mental institutions, all self-admitted. No idea what his inner demons were though. Same job, another employee. Dude seemed nice enough, turns out he had served some time for manslaughter. His story is that he was caught sleeping with a married woman and killed the husband in self-defense. A jury didn't see it that way. After working for about a month he stole a coworker's iPod and never came back. A few days later someone robbed and killed him outside of a bar about a mile from work. Was a representative for my troop at an inter-troop scouting event, which means it was just me and one other kid mixed into groups of other kids from other Boy Scout troops that we'd work with for the duration of the weekend camping trip. When the groups were split up, I ended up in a different group from the other scout from troop, so it was time to become acquainted with the kids who'd have to be my friends for the weekend. There was one scout who looked like a decent kid. I start to talk to him and he lived only a town over from me and was only a year older, and the same rank as I was. I go through the weekend joking with this kid and even sleeping in the same tent as him. And he was very nice and extremely funny. Then the second night things went weird. He revealed to us that he was accused of third-degree theft, and that his trial was pending. He also informed us that he'd been a suspected school shooter and was soon being expelled for that, and lastly, that he had killed multiple animals for fun on prior scouting outings, and he described how he paralyzed and then drowned a turtle just a month prior to this current trip. From that point forward he acted like a real dick. He asked for sexual favors from new, female scouts, and would flash people often. I tried to look the kid up and reached out to friends in this kid's district after returning from the trip and later found out he'd been convicted and was in jail, although he was serving only a short sentence of around half a year. I was going to pay for petrol, and an older woman was going to reach the counter at the same time as me. I gestured for her to go first and smiled. She smiled back and paid for her things. As soon as she was done she turned around and started to scream about me being foreign and taking good jobs. She continues to call me a beast and all sorts of bizarre insults. I realize this woman is obviously troubled and just smile and pay for my things. She keeps going till I'm out of earshot and dear God I should have just paid first, smiley face. Woman I worked with was an emotion vampire. Kept asking me about the baby I lost just to see me cry about it. Finally got to a point where I could give her non-answers while showing no emotion and surprise. Guess what's no longer interesting to talk about? She also kept asking me about my brother I never talked to, no matter how many times I told her she'd seen him more recently than me. She was in her 80s and still working at the time, but she stopped working around the time I had my almost 3 years, so she's probably dead now. I've written about this before, but about 10 years ago, I worked at a pizza place. I didn't have a car at the time, so I would ride my bike back and forth to work. If it was raining, the delivery drivers would usually be nice enough to give me a ride home if they had a delivery in the area, or if they lived close by. There was a delivery driver that worked there. I'll call him V. V was a funny guy. Made everyone laugh and people genuinely liked him at work. He also would give me rides home all the time because he lived close to my apartment. I liked talking to V. We had the same sense of humor and I could joke around with him, which was nice. Then one day, V doesn't show up for work. They call him a couple times to make sure everything was okay, but he didn't answer. Figure it's just a no call, no show. Then we see V on the news later that night. He got high on bath salts and beat his girlfriend to death with a radiator. He's still in prison. I was friends with a girl for about 10 years when we were kids. We grew apart, but our families are still friends, so I see them quite often. Well, this girl had an older sister who I quite looked up to for the longest time. She ended up having mental health problems that she didn't take care of and got onto drugs. In and out of rehabs and jail multiple times. She finally seemed like she was getting better though. Ran into her and her mother at a clothing store and talked to them for a good hour, talking about how much healthier she looked and how well she was doing. Told her I was proud and that her future looked bright. 2 weeks later she stabbed the owner of a hotel to death, walked off and then came back and stabbed the lifeless body some more. She's now in prison for life. When I found out I was so shocked I had to take the rest of the day off of work. I knew a kid in high school a year younger than me in my required personal communications class. He sat at our table and was a jokester, so he was easy to get along with and fun to be around. We never were close outside of that class, just were when we were in it at the time. Found out my mid-senior year that he was caught with child porn, and apparently his electronic/phone use had been watched by the FBI for a little while before it due to suspicious activities that led them to believe he was watching and saving that sort of material. Absolutely never would have imagined him to be a pedophile and someone who would be involved with such things. On the outside he was a completely normal kid, if not a bit extroverted and liked by most people. In college I worked a customer service job and we had a very friendly regular, who was also a student. I made his drinks maybe 3 or so times and he always seemed to be in a good mood while he was there. I think he was friends with some of my co-workers. This guy ended up stabbing and killing another student on our campus in a crowded area in the middle of the day, unprovoked. It turns out he was in a car accident shortly before the stabbing and experienced some head trauma, which completely changed his behavior. I remember reading an article saying his parents saw that his mood had changed after the accident. When he was apprehended and later questioned, I believe he said he hadn't known what had happened and wasn't lucid during the attack. Also, I remember seeing him at the mall only 3 days before this happened, and he was his usual smiling self. Everyone who knew him was very shocked as it was out of character.